My name is Greg, and I spent years working for Colorado Parks and Wildlife. This particular story begins with a very specific fish called the Colorado pike minnow. Decades of overfishing and invasive species have pushed these native fish to the brink of extinction. Protecting them is a priority, and the law is strictly enforced with heavy fines and jail time. Most sportsmen are responsible, but there is always that 10% who think the rules don't apply to them. In the late summer of 1993, my superiors decided it was time to send someone into the deep brush. My destination was the Weminuke Wilderness, the largest untamed area in the state of Colorado. It covers nearly 800 square miles of dense forest and high-altitude lakes. When you step into the Weminuke, you're truly heading into the middle of nowhere. I was specifically tasked with surveying the area around Granite Lake. Reports suggested that the lake's seclusion made it a prime target for illegal pike minnow poaching. The lake sits on the northern slopes of Granite Peak, making it nearly invisible from any maintained road. To facilitate the survey, I planned to stay in an old ranger cabin located on the southern slope. It hadn't been used in 18 months, but I knew it would serve as a sufficient base for a few days. I hit the trail at 5:30 in the morning to ensure I reached the peak by noon. The cabin was in better shape than I expected when I finally arrived. After a quick sweep to clear out the dust, I dropped my gear and prepped for the first patrol. I began my descent toward Granite Lake, the silence of the woods enveloping me. From the higher ridges, the lake looked like a mirror, perfectly still and completely abandoned. I decided to split off toward the Los Pinos River to check the banks for any signs of human activity. After 20 minutes of walking, I finally spotted the first person I had seen all day. A lone fisherman sat on a small camping stool, his gaze fixed intently on the flowing water. I waited until I was within a reasonable distance before calling out a friendly greeting. The man nearly jumped out of his skin, his hand twitching toward his waist as if he were armed. I immediately identified myself as a wildlife officer to de-escalate his obvious terror. He sighed with a relief so intense it was like watching a balloon deflate right in front of me. When I asked if he had seen any pike minnows, he ignored me and asked if they knew I was here. I assumed he meant my superiors at the CPW and told him I never went anywhere without their permission. The man looked at me as if I were speaking a foreign language, his eyes searching the woods behind me. I began to suspect he was hiding something, perhaps worried about being arrested for poaching. He leaned in and warned me that they wouldn't like me being out here without their consent. When I asked who they were, a strange, knowing smirk crossed his weathered face. He whispered that they didn't like people saying their name, a line that felt straight out of a horror movie. I figured he was just an eccentric local trying to scare a government official off his favorite fishing spot. He told me I should leave an offering outside the cabin tonight to see if they granted me permission to stay. I thanked him for the advice with a heavy dose of sarcasm and prepared to head back. He called out one last time, telling me to leave food or money and hoped they let me walk out alive. I rolled my eyes and told him they'd better, unless they wanted the FBI crawling all over these woods. As I hiked back to the cabin, the sun disappeared completely, leaving me in a pitch-black wilderness. The fisherman's warnings seemed ridiculous, yet the absolute silence of the Weminuke began to feel heavy. I reached the cabin and started a fire, unaware that my presence had already been noted by something in the dark. The next morning I stepped out into the crisp mountain air and began my descent toward Granite Lake. From the higher ridges I looked down at the water, which appeared perfectly still and tranquil in the morning light. Deciding to check the more remote sections, I veered northwest to follow the banks of the Los Pinos River. After 20 minutes of trekking through the brush, I spotted a lone figure sitting by the water. I approached quietly to avoid scaring off the fish, stopping a few yards away to announce my presence. When I spoke, the man nearly jumped out of his skin, his hand darting toward his waist as if reaching for a weapon. He exhaled a massive breath of air when he realized I was wearing a law enforcement uniform. I introduced myself as a wildlife officer and explained that I was surveying the local pike minnow population. The man completely ignored my question about the fish and instead looked at me with deep suspicion. He leaned in and asked in a low voice if they knew I was out here. I told him my superiors at CPW knew exactly where I was, assuming that was who he meant. The fisherman shook his head and looked around the forest as if expecting to see hidden spectators. I assured him he wasn't in any trouble and that I only gave warnings to first-time offenders. He didn't seem to be listening, stating flatly that they wouldn't like me being out here without permission. When I asked who exactly he was talking about, a strange, wry smirk spread across his face. He whispered that they don't like it when people say their name out loud. I figured he was just an eccentric local trying to scare a government official off his fishing spot. I humored him and asked how I was supposed to get this mysterious permission to stay on the land. The man told me to leave an offering outside the cabin door before I went to sleep that night. He claimed that if the item was gone in the morning, I had their blessing to stay, but if not, I had to leave immediately. I told him I'd received the message loud and clear and turned to continue my hike. As I walked away, the man shouted out one final piece of advice that made me stop in my tracks. He told me to leave some food or even some money and hoped they saw fit to let me walk out of the woods alive. I shot back that if anyone messed with me, they'd have the FBI roaming these woods in force. I rolled my eyes and kept walking, determined to finish my survey despite the locals' Twilight Zone warnings. For the rest of the day, I didn't see another soul on the riverbanks or near the lakes. I returned to the cabin by sundown, the forest growing quiet as the light began to fail. I started a small campfire outside and began preparing a simple meal of chicken and rice. As I sat there eating, my eyes drifted to the dirt near the fire pit where I'd been walking. My own boot prints were clearly visible, but between them sat a track that looked entirely different. I reached for my flashlight and clicked it on, the beam cutting through the darkness to illuminate the print. The print was narrower and longer than a standard boot, and the tread pattern was oddly familiar. It suddenly clicked. The tread was that of a vehicle tire, carved into the shape of a shoe sole. The tracks were fresh, meaning someone had been circling my cabin while I was down at the river. I wondered if the fisherman had followed me, but I didn't remember seeing such bizarre footwear on him. I decided to follow the tracks to see where they led, moving cautiously with my light aimed at the earth. The trail led to a high-rise about 80 yards away that overlooked the cabin perfectly. There I found multiple sets of those strange shoe prints, showing where people had sat and watched me for hours. I realized then that the fisherman's warning about them wasn't a joke or a legend. They were real and they were watching. I retreated inside and bolted the door, but as I looked at the small mail slot, a cold realization hit me that no lock could keep out what was already waiting in the shadows. I stood paralyzed in the center of the cabin as the floorboards groaned under my shifting weight. The silence of the Wemanuke wilderness felt heavier than it had just an hour ago. I decided I couldn't stay trapped inside without knowing what was circling the perimeter. I slowly unlatched the heavy wooden door and stepped out onto the porch. The cold mountain air hit my face, carrying the scent of damp pine and old wood smoke. I clicked on my flashlight and swept the beam across the soft, muddy earth surrounding the cabin. The light illuminated a series of deep indentations in the muck near the porch steps. These weren't the prints of any hiking boot I had ever seen in my years of service. The soles had left clear impressions of tire tread patterns, zigzagging in a crude fashion. It looked as if someone had fashioned makeshift shoes out of old truck tires. My heart began to pound against my ribs as I realized how fresh the prints were. Water was still seeping into the edges of the tracks, meaning they were made only minutes ago. I followed the trail of prints as they circled the entire cabin structure. Under each window, the mud was trampled flat as if someone had stood there for a long duration. Someone had been watching me eat my dinner through the glass. I needed to see if they were still nearby, so I turned my gaze toward the rising ridge. I clicked off my flashlight to let my eyes adjust to the natural darkness. The forest was a wall of black ink against the slightly lighter gray of the sky. I scanned the tree line on the ridge about 50 yards away from the porch. A sudden movement caught my eye near a cluster of ancient spruce trees. A tall, thin figure was standing perfectly still between two trunks, staring down at me. Then another figure appeared to the left of the first one. Within seconds, I counted 4 distinct silhouettes lining the crest of the hill. They weren't wearing modern hunting gear or any reflective materials. They stood with a stillness that was utterly inhuman and predatory. I quickly retreated back into the cabin and slammed the door shut. I threw the deadbolt and leaned my back against the wood, breathing heavily. The warning from the old fisherman at the lake echoed in my mind with terrifying clarity. He had told me to leave an offering, but I had ignored his superstitious rambling. Now it felt as though the land itself was turning against my presence. I moved to the windows and began pulling the heavy curtains shut as fast as I could. I caught a glimpse of a pale face reflecting in the glass just before the fabric covered it. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely grip the curtain rods. I reached for my radio to call for backup, but all I heard was static. The deep canyons of the wilderness were swallowing my signal whole. Every creak of the cabin settling sounded like a footstep on the porch. I grabbed my service weapon and sat on the floor, facing the front door. The tire tread footprints suggested a community that lived outside the modern world. I realized then that I wasn't dealing with common hikers or poachers. Suddenly, the light from my lantern flickered and died, leaving me in total darkness as a slow, rhythmic scratching began on the outside of the door. I stood paralyzed in the pitch blackness as the scratching on the wood grew into a rhythmic scraping sound. My breath hitched in my throat when the scratching suddenly ceased, replaced by a heavy metallic click. The old-fashioned brass mail slot on the door began to creak open slowly from the outside. A set of gray, calloused fingers with thick, claw-like nails curled around the edge of the metal flap. The skin on the hand was mapped with deep, jagged scars that looked like ancient topographical lines. I watched, unable to move, as the hand fumbled blindly for the deadbolt on the inside of the door. Acting on instinct, I lunged forward and slammed my boot against the door to keep the hand from advancing. A muffled, guttural grunt vibrated through the wood as the fingers retreated sharply into the night. For a moment, the silence was so heavy it felt like it was pressing against my eardrums. Suddenly, the sharp crack of a gunshot shattered the silence and sent a splintering hole through the window glass. I threw myself onto the floorboards as a thick cloud of acrid white smoke wafted through the broken pane. The smell was unmistakable, sulfur and charcoal, the signature scent of old-fashioned black powder. A second blast followed, the heavy lead ball thudding into the timber wall just inches above my head. These weren't modern rifles. Someone was laying siege to the cabin with antique muzzleloaders. I crawled toward my gear, searching for my service weapon in the suffocating darkness. Outside, I could hear the slow, methodical reloading process, the ramrod sliding down the barrel. Voices began to rise from the tree line, chanting in a dialect I didn't recognize. The chanting was low and guttural, sounding more like a ritual than a warning. Another shot rang out, this time hitting the heavy iron stove and ringing like a funeral bell. I realized the attackers were positioned on 3 sides of the cabin, trapping me inside. I heard the heavy thud of a boot landing on the porch, the wood groaning under the weight. The door handle began to rattle violently as if someone was trying to rip it from the frame. I shouted that I was a law enforcement officer, but my voice was swallowed by another volley of gunfire. A heavy axe blade suddenly bit through the front door, the metal gleaming in the dark. They weren't trying to scare me anymore, they were breaking in to finish what they started. Through the new hole in the door, I saw a pair of eyes reflecting the moonlight like a predator's. I fired a warning shot into the ceiling, the deafening roar echoing in the small space. The gunfire outside stopped instantly, but the chanting grew louder and more frantic. I knew the back window was my only chance, though it led straight into the densest part of the woods. I grabbed my flashlight and my heavy coat, preparing for a blind sprint into the wilderness. A torch was suddenly lit outside, the orange glow flickering through the cracks in the walls. They were going to burn the cabin down with me inside if I didn't move now. I kicked out the remaining glass of the back window and scrambled through the frame. I hit the frozen ground hard, the impact jarring my teeth, but I didn't stop to check for injuries. Behind me, I heard the front door finally give way with a sickening crash of splintering wood. I sprinted into the tree line, branches clawing at my face like the fingers I had seen in the mail slot. I could hear the heavy boots of my pursuers hitting the ground behind me, keeping a steady pace. The forest seemed to stretch on forever, a maze of ancient pines and treacherous ravines. My lungs burned in the thin mountain air, but the fear of what they would do if they caught me kept me moving. I reached a clearing and realized with a jolt of horror that I had run straight toward the ridge where I had seen them earlier. As I turned to find a new path, a dozen torches ignited simultaneously all around the perimeter of the clearing, boxing me in. The sudden ignition of a dozen torches turned the dark clearing into a flickering orange arena of death. I didn't wait for a command or a shot. I simply bolted toward the thinnest gap in the wall of fire. A heavy lead ball from a muzzle-loader whistled past my ear and shattered a sapling right beside my head. I dove headlong into a dense thicket of scrub oak, feeling the branches tear at my skin and uniform. Adrenaline numbed the pain of the thorns as I scrambled back to my feet and pushed deeper into the blackness. Behind me, I could hear the guttural shouts of the men signaling to each other across the ridges. I discarded my heavy gear, keeping only my sidearm and a small flashlight I didn't dare to turn on. Every snapping twig in the distance sounded like a footstep closing in on my position. My lungs burned in the thin mountain air as I navigated by the faint light of the stars above. I reached a stream and waded into the freezing water to mask my scent from any dogs they might have. The icy water felt like needles stabbing into my ankles, but I pushed forward against the current. I felt a sudden movement on the bank and dropped into a crouch, drawing my service weapon. It was only a deer startled by my presence, leaping away into the undergrowth. Hours passed as I moved like a ghost through the Wemanuke wilderness, my body reaching its limit. The realization hit me that these people knew every inch of this terrain better than I ever would. I stumbled upon a narrow dirt track that didn't appear on any of my official maps. Along the side of the road, I saw strange wooden idols carved with twisted, screaming faces. These were the warnings the fishermen had spoken of, markers of a territory I was never meant to enter. In the distance, the low rumble of a heavy engine broke the silence of the woods. I ran toward the sound, ignoring the protests of my aching muscles and bruised feet. An old logging truck appeared around a bend, kicking up clouds of dust in the morning light. I jumped into the middle of the road, waving my arms wildly to get the driver's attention. The truck screeched to a halt, the driver leaning out with a look of pure confusion. I flashed my badge and climbed into the cab before he could even ask what was happening. The driver looked at my torn clothes and bloodied face, his grip tightening on the steering wheel. "You were up at Granite Lake, weren't you?" he asked in a voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, telling him we needed to get to the nearest sheriff's station immediately. As we drove, he began to tell me about the families that lived in the deepest parts of the wilderness. They were a primitive community that had rejected modern society over a century ago. He explained that they didn't recognize state laws and protected their isolation with lethal force. Local authorities knew they were there, but chose to leave them alone to avoid a bloody confrontation. I was a pawn in a game of negligence, sent into a war zone without any warning. We reached the small town of Creed, and I marched straight into the local precinct. The deputy behind the desk looked at my condition and immediately reached for his radio. I gave my report detailing the muzzle loaders, the tire tread footprints, and the coordinated attack. They told me that I was lucky to be alive, as several trespassers had vanished in that area over the years. I realized the offering the fisherman suggested wasn't just a tradition, it was a ransom for one's life. I was reassigned to a different district the very next week, my superiors eager to bury the incident. I never went back to the Wemanuke, but the sound of a snapping twig still makes my heart race. I often wonder how many others are still up there living in a world that time forgot. Years later, in 2015, another man would find himself entering a different kind of trap in the woods. This man was a renovation expert, hired for a job that seemed too good to be true. As he pulled up to the remote site, he noticed a man in oversized sunglasses watching him from the porch, holding a thick envelope. Elias stepped out of his truck, the mountain air feeling unusually heavy as he looked at the isolated cabin. The man on the porch did not move, his face obscured by massive dark sunglasses that reflected the surrounding trees. Elias adjusted his tool belt, feeling a prickle of sweat despite the cool breeze blowing through the timber. He walked toward the stairs, the gravel crunching loudly in the eerie silence of the clearing. The stranger finally stood up, revealing a tall, gaunt frame dressed in an expensive but ill-fitting suit. Without a word of greeting, the man held out a thick manila envelope that appeared to be bursting at the seams. Elias took the package and peeked inside, gasping at the sight of stacked $100 bills. The man's voice was a low, rasping whisper as he explained that the interior needed to be gutted immediately. He specified that the work must be done alone and always after the sun had begun to set. Elias asked why the timeline was so strange, but the client simply turned his head toward the dark woods. The client's reflection in the sunglasses showed Elias standing like a small, vulnerable target. Reluctantly, Elias agreed to the terms, lured by the sheer amount of untraceable cash. As Elias entered the cabin for the first time, the smell of rot and old cedar hit him like a physical blow. He noticed that the walls were covered in strange circular patterns scratched deep into the wood. From the corner of his eye, Elias saw the client watching him through a gap in the floorboards from the crawl space below. He jumped back, but when he looked again, there was nothing but shadows and dust bunnies. Elias began his work, swinging a sledgehammer into the brittle plaster of the kitchen walls. Behind the first wall, he found not insulation, but hundreds of dried animal bones tied together with twine. A cold shiver ran down his spine as he realized the bones were arranged in a specific, ritualistic order. He heard a soft clicking sound coming from the ceiling and looked up to find a small black lens. Elias realized he was being filmed, his every move tracked by the man who had hired him. He reached for his phone to call for help, but the screen showed absolutely no signal in this deep valley. Outside, the sun had fully set, and the woods became an impenetrable wall of blackness. A heavy thud echoed from the roof, followed by the sound of something dragging a heavy weight across the shingles. Elias grabbed his heavy-duty flashlight and stepped onto the porch to investigate. The driveway was empty, and his truck was the only vehicle remaining under the pines. He scanned the tree line and saw several pairs of eyes reflecting his light from different heights. Elias retreated inside and bolted the door, his heart hammering against his ribs. He found a small note tucked into his tool bag that wasn't there when he arrived. The note simply read, "You look best when you're working hard," written in jagged, shaky script. He realized the client was not just watching him, but was likely still inside the house. He moved silently toward the back bedroom, holding his hammer like a weapon. Inside the closet, he found a life-size mannequin dressed exactly like himself, down to the same brand of work boots. The mannequin's face was a crude mask made of photographs of Elias taken from a distance. He heard the distinct sound of a liquid being poured against the exterior walls of the cabin. The sharp, unmistakable smell of gasoline began to seep through the floorboards. Elias tried the windows, but they had all been nailed shut from the outside while he was working. He looked back at the trail camera and saw the red light blinking faster, recording his struggle. He heard the strike of a match and a low, mocking laugh from the other side of the door. As the first flame licked the wood, the client leaned into the window and whispered, "This is the final scene." The client's words hung in the air like a death sentence as the fire roared to life. Smoke began to curl around the floorboards, thick and acrid with the smell of accelerant. I lunged for the front door, my boots thudding against the dry, aging timber. The heavy brass handle wouldn't budge, having been bolted shut from the outside. I slammed my shoulder into the wood, but the door felt like a solid brick wall. Heat radiated through the walls as the gasoline-soaked exterior ignited in a flash. I turned toward the window, only to see the man in sunglasses watching me calmly. He didn't move a muscle, his expression hidden behind those dark, reflective lenses. I grabbed a heavy iron fire poker and swung it with everything I had at the glass. The glass shattered into 1,000 shards, letting in a rush of cold night air. I scrambled over the sill, my skin stinging from the proximity of the growing inferno. My feet hit the damp soil and I immediately rolled away from the heat. I scanned the darkness for the client, but he had vanished into the tree line. Coughing from the smoke, I realized the entire structure was going up like a tinderbox. As I backed away, I tripped over something small and metallic, hidden in a bush. I reached down and pulled out a high-definition trail camera mounted on a stake. The lens was pointed directly at the window I had just escaped from. I looked around and saw a small red light blinking on a second camera in the tree above me. There were dozens of them, all positioned to capture every angle of the cabin's destruction. This wasn't just an insurance scam, it was a carefully choreographed execution. I heard the crunch of dry leaves behind me and didn't wait to see who it was. I sprinted toward my truck, the only sanctuary left in this nightmare landscape. I fumbled for my keys, my hands shaking so violently I nearly dropped them in the dirt. The engine roared to life, and I slammed the gear into reverse without looking back. My headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the man in sunglasses standing in the middle of the road. I didn't slow down, forcing him to dive into the ditch as I sped past. I drove for miles, my eyes darting to the rearview mirror every few seconds. I reached for my phone to call the police, but the screen was dead and wouldn't turn on. I realized then that my belongings had been tampered with while I was working. He had planned this for weeks, learning my routine and isolating me completely. I saw a set of headlights appear in the distance behind me, matching my speed. I pushed the gas pedal to the floor, the engine whining under the strain. My hands were bleeding from the broken glass, but I couldn't feel the pain through the adrenaline. Finally, I reached the main highway, the lights of a gas station flickering in the distance. I pulled into the lot, tires screeching as I skidded to a halt in front of the pumps. I ran inside the store, screaming for the attendant to call 911. The attendant looked at me like I was a madman, but he slowly picked up the phone. Hours later, the police informed me that the cabin had burned to the ground. They found the cameras, but the memory cards had all been removed before they arrived. As the sun rose, I found a small package on the seat of my truck containing a single DVD labeled First Draft. It was the winter of 1987, and Sarah and I had finally saved enough to rent a secluded cabin in the Green Mountains of Vermont. The cabin was a perfect escape from our busy lives, tucked away at the end of a long, unplowed driveway. We spent the first few days in a blissful haze of wood fires, hot chocolate, and the absolute silence of the wilderness. On the fourth night, a frantic pounding on the heavy oak door shattered the quiet of our evening. Sarah gripped my arm as we heard a man's voice screaming for help from the other side of the wood. I approached the window cautiously and saw a man collapsed on our porch, clutching his leg. He looked half frozen, and blood was soaking through the fabric of his torn trousers. Despite a nagging feeling in my gut, I couldn't leave a man to die in the sub-zero temperatures. I swung the door open, and the icy wind rushed in, bringing the scent of pine and metallic copper. We helped him to the armchair near the fire, and he groaned in a way that sounded almost practiced. As Sarah went to get a first aid kit, I noticed the man's eyes scanning the room with a sharp, predatory intensity. He claimed his car had slid off the ravine a mile back, but I hadn't heard any engine sounds for hours. Sarah knelt down to clean his wound, but she suddenly froze and looked up at me with wide, terrified eyes. I looked down and saw that the blood on his leg wasn't coming from a cut, but was merely smeared on the surface of his skin. I realized in that split second that the man was perfectly fine and had lured us into opening the door. The stranger's expression changed instantly, his fake whimpers replaced by a cold, jagged grin. Before I could react, he lunged at me, throwing his weight with a strength that was terrifying. I felt the cold sting of steel as he pulled a hunting knife from the lining of his heavy parka. Sarah didn't scream. She grabbed a heavy cast-iron skillet from the kitchen counter and swung it with everything she had. The blow connected with a sickening thud, sending the man stumbling away from me and across the coffee table. I scrambled to my feet, my sweater soaked with my own blood where the blade had grazed my side. "Run to the bedroom," I yelled, grabbing Sarah's hand as the stranger began to stand back up like a machine. We slammed the bedroom door and shoved the heavy dresser in front of it just as he threw himself against the wood. The sound of his knife thudding into the door from the other side sent chills down my spine. There was no phone in the cabin, and our car keys were still sitting on the kitchen table with the predator. I remembered the small crawl space under the floorboards where the owners kept the emergency supplies. We lowered ourselves into the cramped, freezing space just as the dresser began to give way under the man's assault. We lay there in the dark, listening to his heavy boots pacing directly above our heads. He started singing a low, distorted lullaby, his voice scraping against the quiet of the house. Suddenly, the pacing stopped, and I saw the tip of his knife poking through the floorboards just inches from Sarah's face. I knew we couldn't stay there. We had to move toward the exterior vent and get out into the snow. We squeezed through the narrow vent, the jagged cinder blocks tearing at our clothes and skin. The cold hit us like a physical blow, but the adrenaline kept our hearts hammering against our ribs. We saw the stranger's silhouette appear at the bedroom window, looking out into the night for us. We ran toward the woods, our boots sinking deep into the fresh powder with every desperate step. Behind us, the front door of the cabin flew open, and the man emerged, screaming with a rage that wasn't human. We reached the main road after what felt like hours, my lungs burning in the frozen air. A snowplow driver saw us and stopped, his headlights cutting through the darkness like a beacon of hope. When the police reached the cabin an hour later, the fire was still burning, but the stranger had vanished into the timber. They found several sets of ID cards in the crawlspace belonging to people who had gone missing in those mountains years prior. We never went back to the mountains, realizing that some shadows in the timber are better left undisturbed. The woods hold many secrets, and sometimes the greatest monster is the one you invite into your home out of kindness.